These newspaper article readings are not for the faint-hearted or the squeamish. If you're at all sensitive, I might suggest these aren't for you. If in doubt, check the description below. It'll tell you which topics are covered in this particular episode. There's both human and animal suicides, and you heard that right. There's also horrific descriptions of injuries, as well as the deaths of youngsters. So don't do it to yourself if you're prone to nightmares, is all I'll say right now. Not all the articles are horrible. Some of them are uplifting, some of them show incredible bravery and heroism. There are near misses. So these were picked as showing life prior to health and safety, as well as for the crazy and curious details some contain with other miscellaneous happenings that kind of struck me enough to post the articles to Twitter, despite not having too much relevance to Scotland necessarily. These are worldwide topics, and they didn't have any real connection to the projects that I was working on and researching at the time. I just happened to have come across them by the way, kind of thing. So we'll get into them, shall we? What we're going to do here is we're going to do a lucky dip of newspaper articles to really mix them up a wee bit, because while I'm doing the researches, I'm obviously coming up with the same kind of terms and things. So we'll mix them up even further. So to that end, I have all of the newspaper titles and dates of the articles. So first up today, we have the Edinburgh Evening News for the 14th of April, 1906. So this one gives us King Edward in a carriage accident. The Standard Corfu correspondent telegraphs. King Edward was in an accident yesterday. The royal carriage came into collision with a cart driven by some drunken peasants. His Majesty's equipage was comparatively uninjured, but the peasants were thrown out of their vehicle, and one of the men had a leg and an arm broken. The King and Queen alighted, and His Majesty helped to remove one of the peasants from under the wheels, and in a few kindly words expressed sympathy. Learning the King's identity, one of the peasants knelt in gratitude and attempted to kiss His Majesty's feet. The King prevented this act, whereupon the man tried to pay similar homage to the Queen, and had forcibly to be restrained by the gentlemen of the suite. On the King's instructions, a doctor from the flagship was sent to attend the injured peasant. From the Edinburgh Evening News, 14th of April, 1906. Well, that gives us an idea of the kind of deference that some people felt they had to pay to the upper classes, despite the fact that they were apparently injured. And at 1906, we're still getting people called peasants, which seems like an archaic term these days, or a term we use jokingly when, referring to the upper class's treatment of the working class, I guess. But yeah, so there we go, King Edward and his accident. So that's from the Edinburgh Evening News, 14th of April, 1906. Next, we have two, apparently. Take this one. The Dundee Courier for the 27th of March, 1906. This gives us a rather sad article entitled "Found Dying on His Wife's Grave." A very sad affair, resulting in the death of an old man, a widower, residing at Bothwell Park, was reported yesterday. It seems that on Saturday evening, while the superintendent of Bothwell Cemetery was making his last round before closing the gates for the day, he came across a man lying on one of the graves, in an exhausted condition and with a paper pinned to his breast, stating that he was dying. His wife was buried at the spot some time ago, and he had evidently struggled there to breathe his last. The matter was at once reported to the Inspector of the Poor, who had the man examined by the medical officer, who in turn ordered his removal to the Kirklands Asylum, Bothwell, where he was immediately conveyed. The patient was in a weak and delirious state. He gradually sank and died about 2 o'clock on Sunday morning. And that's from the Dundee Courier, the 27th of March, 1906. I'm not sure that they should have removed him. I feel like he had gone to such lengths in such an unwell condition to attempt to make his last wish possible, in being with his wife as he ended his life. So, I don't know that I would have removed him. I think I may have elicited volunteers to stay with him, possibly, to fulfill his last wish. Despite whether he was poor or not, your financial status shouldn't deny you your rights as a human. It shouldn't deny you the humanity of others, you know. So, yeah, that's a rather sad article, that one. Next up, we have a double dunter, so this may end us. So we have The Scotsman for the 7th of April 1905, with a follow-up article from the same newspaper dated the 8th of April 1905. Let's find out what this gives us. This is a more positive article. Accident to a mountaineer. A distressing and somewhat peculiar accident occurred on Ben Nevis yesterday, by which the Reverend Mr. Robertson, Edinburgh, a prominent member of the Scottish Mountaineering Club, was severely injured. Notwithstanding that the day was a most unsuitable one for climbing, there being an almost continuous fall of snow accompanied by thunder and lightning, Mr. Robertson set out alone to make the ascent of Ben Nevis. He succeeded in reaching the summit, and on his downward journey, when near the edge of one of the precipices, he was negotiating a dangerous snow slope, holding on with his ice axe, when a vivid flash of lightning, which Mr. Robertson thinks struck the axe, occurred, and he was precipitated over the slope, and calculated that he must have fallen nearly 1,000 feet. How long he lay at the foot he cannot say. He must have dragged himself to his hotel in Fort William in a semi-conscious state, for he recollects nothing of the descent or afterwards. On his face and head are several large gaping wounds, while his arms and legs are one mass of bruises and wounds. The miracle is that Mr. Robertson was not instantly killed. That's followed the next day. The accident on Ben Nevis. The Reverend Mr. Robertson, who ran such a narrow escape on Ben Nevis, is, notwithstanding the serious nature of his injuries, progressing very favourably, although it will be at least a month before complete restoration can be looked for. Being now in a less unstrung condition, he is able freely to speak of his accident, and explains that when it happened he was not in the vicinity of the precipices, but on a snow slope about 500 feet below the summit. The severity of the blizzard which prevailed made him rather keep further to the south than the line of the bridle path in order to avoid the cliffs, but owing to the mist and driving snow, he had unconsciously deviated further than had been his intention. He distinctly recollects that the thunder and lightning seemed very near, and that the steel head of his ice axe hissed with electric sparks. Doubtless St. Elmo's fire, which was a phenomenon frequently noted during the time the observatory was in operation. It is Mr. Robertson's belief that a flash of lightning struck either his ice axe or the ground near where he was, thus rendering him unconscious. On falling, he must have been hurled with terrific force down about 1,000 feet over the frozen boulders strewn upon the hillside, but of what actually took place, He has not the faintest recollection. He can recall nothing until he found himself making for the path from the direction of Ben Nevis, and at an altitude considerably over 1,000 feet lower than the point where he calculates he was rendered unconscious. He had lost his cap and ice axe. His clothes were torn and blood was oozing freely from his wounds, but as already stated, he managed by a supreme effort to walk unaided to Fort William, which was distant nearly 3 miles. Our Portobello correspondent writes, "The victim of the accident is a Reverend A.E. Robertson, No. 3 White House Loan, Edinburgh. For the past 6 months, during the illness and since the death of the Reverend John Seller, minister of the Regent Street United Free Church, Portobello, Mr. Robertson had filled the pulpit and undertaken the pastorate of that church, and he took farewell of the congregation on Sunday evening last. He was not a candidate for the vacant charge, which has now been filled by the calling of the Reverend Robert White, Annan. Mr. Robertson is a prominent and enthusiastic member of the Scottish Mountaineering Club, and by means of lectures has from time to time given the benefit of his experience to interested audiences. One of his most recent lectures having been given only a few weeks ago in Regent Street Church on behalf of the Sunday School funds, it is recalled that in a lecture he minimised the perils and terrors of mountaineering as apprehended by the popular mind, and declared that the practised climber had such knowledge of where to place foot and axe and hand that the risk of accident was very little indeed. He is said to hold the record for having ascended the greatest number of mountains in Scotland, and before his accident he had climbed Ben Nevis 23 times. He informed a member of Regent Street Church with whom he dined on Sunday that he proposed taking a 6 months' holiday to be spent in mountaineering, and that, as a beginning, he would set out for Fort William on Tuesday. He made very many friends in Portobello, and when it became known that he was the clergyman who had suffered by the accident, a great deal of sympathy was expressed and many inquiring messages were dispatched to Fort William." And that's from the Scotsman for the 7th and 8th of April 1905. And that'll end us for today on a little more of a positive note. So we'll maybe see you next time. Take care.